Thanks a lot for coming in.
Good morning, happy to be here.
Something about this community appeals to you?
This is a wonderful place to live.
For Kelowna Now, this is Camp Mulgat. And we're joined by Sharon Simpson, the granddaughter of Stanley Simpson, who started that mill in the first place that we just saw officially closed. Tell me what was going through your mind when that final date rolled around. Yep, it's over for that mill.
I was really sad, Ken. It's like I'm losing some of my roots. And I'm also really, I'm sad for the people who's built a life around that mill and built a community around that mill, and that has gone into history.
Yeah. And what a big part of Kelowna's history that mill was. And I know you're not just Stanley's granddaughter, but also a historian. How important was that sawmill to Kelowna after it got started in the early part of the 30s?
It was the major employer for many years, year-round employer. We had orchards which were seasonal and packing houses which were seasonal. This was a year-round employer. I've heard stories of people who, there used to be a whistle that went at noon. Kids went home. There was a whistle that sort of signaled the end of the day. Kids gathered from the park and went home. At lunchtime, people knew when it was lunchtime because there was a whistle from the mill and that told them. Right. For a few years, there was a lot of labor unrest, and contracts were annual. So if there was a strike over Christmas time, the whole community was impacted. Nobody went shopping. Grocery stores survived on credit, and it was a big part of what was going on in the community. Also, there's the other legacies. There's the Simpson Covenant and Knox Mountain Park, which are legacies coming directly out of that sawmill.
Right. And okay, well, let's launch into that because it sometimes gets confusing. There's that Manhattan Point area mill that we know, but the Simpson Covenant, this was your grandfather's deal with the city where he turned over property, but the deal was that it had to remain for the enjoyment of the residents of Kelowna. But this was not that mill. This was the former Kelowna.
It was the Kelowna sawmill
that he had purchased in 1942.
42, but that sawmill had been built at the foot of Bernard Avenue in about 1898, and it was owned by David Lloyd Jones, who was subsequently named, the ferry was named after David Lloyd Jones, and there is a David Lloyd Jones retirement house in Kelowna. But David Lloyd Jones and his partners ran that mill, which burned several times, by the way, until about 1942, which is when my grandfather bought it from him. Part of buying it was the timber rights that were attached to a sawmill, so you made sure that you had a supply of logs. And when 1942, the war was going on, World War II, there was wartime quotas for boxes and lumber that the mills had to meet. So when the Kelowna sawmill burnt down in 1942, my grandfather moved all the production to Manhattan Beach and just left the mill, the remnants of the mill, until the city at 1944 was looking for a site to build a civic center. And it was still covered with debris from the fire because nobody had time to go and clean it up. So at that point, the city approached him and asked if he would part with the land, and that's when the initial agreement was made. The first agreement was for the land east of Water Street, and then the city decided in their wisdom that it would be silly not to take the other portion that's along the lakeshore. So that was all included, and it was, the community voted by referendum to purchase that land. The sale price was about $55,000, which covered the cost of cleaning up the fire debris.
Right. And what a great legacy that is. It must be so wonderful to have that in your family history, to have been really, part of the energy that created what we see as that sort of signature part of our downtown.
I'm riding on my grandfather's coattails. I had nothing to do with it. I'm amazed that, and really pleased that he had the wisdom to see that potential. But, I mean, yes, I eventually defended his wisdom.
But isn't it sweet how he cared that it remained for the enjoyment?
Yes, absolutely.
It wasn't just a money transaction.
It really wasn't a money transaction. He had a vision for this community, and that's how we saw the vision playing out.
And when you look back at the history of that mill and the one at the north end of town, the Simpson Mill, fires everywhere. There was
always. Well, what do? You've got sawdust piles. You've got saws with sawdust lying all around it. You've got machinery. You store gas cans and oil cans on the site. They were pretty spectacular fires many times.
Right, but there was a key one that happened not long before the Second World War. Where Stanley had to rebuild.
That was 1939 in the winter, and it was, I think, the sawmill and the veneer plant, and at night, broke out at night, and a few days later they found a bottle with a rag and gas in it. It was set on fire intentionally. My grandfather was a really cautious man, and he always paid his insurance premiums. So the country was still embroiled in the Depression at that time, but he managed to go out and find the equipment that he needed to restart the mill. He was ready to go in September, but it was also September that war was declared on Germany.
Right.
And had he not reprovisioned the mill prior to that, there would be no machinery available for him to purchase once the war got started. So he was very, very involved in wartime production. There's stories of a wire being received at the office about one of the cargo ships loaded with lumber and boxes was torpedoed in the Atlantic, and would they hurry up and replace all of that?
Right. Yeah.
So Kelowna, that sawmill was very much part of the war effort.
Right. And in those early days, you were talking about how they'd be listening for the horn to go off to signify lunch. Kelowna was a real mill town. I mean, it was the real center for employment.
It was a major employer, and lots of kids started their working lives there and finished their working lives there. There's also some lovely stories about sons or daughters, mostly sons, of mill employees who would break out of town and go to university, but they'd always come back to the mill for summer jobs. And the mill guys always made sure the university students got the very worst jobs possible so that they would not be deterred from going back to school. I mean, they would be cleaning out the glue bins and the boilers, and the worst jobs always went to these kids.
Oh my goodness. And then so in all of the decades since, Kelowna has diversified in so many ways, but it stayed, it did survive a long time.
90 years. It's 90 years sawmill has been on that property.
Crown Zellerback and Fletcher Challenge. And
Crown Zellerback, Crown, BC Forest, Fletcher Challenge, Riverside, and now Tolko. But the really interesting thing is none of those forest companies exist anymore. They've all disappeared.
Wow.
But it's a really cyclical industry, and that's what happens.
But it is amazing how long it did persist. It started to become sort of a background element of our local economy, but it chugged along until just now.
Just now, yeah.
And but you had an opportunity to kind of get in there and have a little look at it before the final day. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I phoned up Tolko and said, can I have a nostalgia tour? Because I remember this sawmill as a kid. And I didn't know what they'd say. And it turned out that I had a wonderful morning with the site manager And we walked every catwalk and every stairway and by every saw, every piece of equipment. There's an old building on the site, an original building, I think, with the old timbers, the massive old timbers in the roof, the beams. I don't know what it was used for, but they apparently offered the timbers to a developer. It's too expensive for them to take them out.
Right.
But we walked through the plywood plant, which was built in '56, and all the veneer presses, which haven't been operated in years because, and I can't remember when the plywood plant shut down, but a few years ago. The presses are still there. We had to get out our flashlights on our phones to look at them. We walked all over the site. It was, I went out on the tug. The tug is still called the Stanley M, which was my grandfather. We went out and circled around the booms. It was wonderful.
And a lot of that equipment, it's so big inside is there anything you wanted to just grab as a memento?
Oh, there's lots of things. Demolition is going to be a huge and expensive challenge. They had upgraded some of the saws and some of the equipment because originally it was a temporary shutdown.
Right.
And so there's brand new equipment, so they will take a lot of that out and use it at other plants. A lot of it will simply end up in dumpsters.
Right. And then once it gets cleaned up, what do you envision happening with that piece of property? What would be a fitting future for that property that would maybe be in keeping with the legacy?
Oh, I expect the developers are salivating.
Right.
I would like to think there would be some tribute, not just to the mill, but all the people who worked there. I think that it provided a really good life and a really good retirement for many people, and they devoted years of their working life to it. I think there should be tributes to those people in recognition of what they have all contributed to the community.
Right. And I noticed when, prior to our interview here, when I brought up the loss of history, maybe your first concern was for the people who were just working there, most recently. It is,
Yeah.
I mean, we don't want to forget that. This is not just a loss of history. For some people, this is very much an in-the-moment sad time.
Kent, it's losing my roots somewhat, although, I have the memories. However, all of these guys who have worked there, and many of them have worked there for years, they're losing their futures. And it's going to be a terrible challenge to them. I'm sure for Tolko to make this decision, it was a really, really hard decision.
Right.
They don't like to see this happen to their workforce any more than, I'm a bystander, but I know that people have committed their lives to that organization, and I think this is a really sad ending.
Right. Well, hate to end it on a sad note like that, but it was really fun to talk about the good times as well. Thanks for coming and telling
My
us all
pleasure.
about it.
Thanks for asking me.
Sharon Simpson. And thank you for watching Kelowna Now.